all the way through, God is 100% for you. And God has given so many gifts to us. Most notably, of course, the gift of Jesus, the gift of his Spirit, the gift of salvation, the gift of forgiveness, the gift of eternal life, but so many other gifts as well that contribute towards that fullness of life that Jesus came to bring. And I think one of those gifts is the beautiful gift of Sabbath. And so with half term upon us, I want to talk this morning a little bit about rest. In this passage, there are two stories that take place on the Sabbath. In the first story, Jesus says these words. He says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." In the second story, Jesus heals this man with the shriveled hand on the Sabbath. It causes him to get into all kinds of trouble with the authorities following this, and bearing in mind that we're only actually in Mark chapter 3, they are already plotting to have Jesus executed because of what he does on the Sabbath. But he heals somebody on the Sabbath. And I just wonder whether, as well as being an incredible, miraculous story from the life of Jesus, I wonder also whether it depicts what God intends for all of us through the amazing gift of the Sabbath. So what is the Sabbath? What does it mean? It's a good question. It's not something we're very familiar with in our Western society anymore. The word Sabbath means to cease or to stop, particularly to cease or to stop working. And it also means to delight and to enjoy. The Sabbath was something that was modeled to us by God right at the beginning of creation. We read in Genesis chapter 1 that God worked for 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. He Sabbathed. God doesn't rest because he's exhausted. He rests, I think, to instill something into the very rhythm of creation, something into the very rhythm of the universe. He rests in order to delight in what it is that he has made. As we read through Genesis chapter 1 and on into the early verses of chapter 2, we see that God blesses 3 things in that chapter. The first thing is that he blesses the animals. He blesses your gerbil or your dog. He says to the animals, "Be fruitful and increase in number." Verse 22 of Genesis chapter 1. That's how he blesses them. In verse 28, he blesses human beings. And he says this to them. He says, "Be fruitful and increase in number." And then he goes on, he says, "Fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it." In other words, God blesses our work. He blesses our work. We were created to work. And I want to stress that work takes a great many forms. I'm not just simply talking about paid employment, but we were created to work, created to fill the earth, to subdue it, to rule over it. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for work is the same word as the Hebrew word for worship. Our work is our worship, or at least part of our worship to God. We were created to work, and God blesses it. But then he blesses a third thing. Chapter 2 and verse 3, it says this: "God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." You see, God blesses our work, but he also blesses our rest. He blesses our stopping. He blesses our ceasing. He blesses our enjoyment and our delighting. A little bit later in the story, we find that the Sabbath becomes enshrined in law. along with the other commandments, the 10 commandments that God gives to the Jewish people, along with commandments like do not steal or do not murder or do not lie, God also says to the people, as one of those commandments, keep the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath. Just think about that for a moment. Think about who it was that God was giving that law to. He was giving it to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. The Israelites had been slaves for 400 years. They had been miraculously delivered from slavery in Egypt. They had not had a single day off for 400 years. They hadn't had a moment for generation after generation after generation to stop, to cease from work, or to delight in what it was that they had been doing for 400 years. Actually, one of the signs of modern day slavery is to not have any opportunity to cease from working. You would think, if that was you and that was your people, you would think you would not need to be told to take a day off when the opportunity came. But it's interesting when you read the story of Israel, how actually they repeatedly want to return to Egypt. Even once they've been delivered, they long to go back to Egypt. It's like they are addicted to Egypt. It's like they're addicted to slavery. They keep complaining against Moses and the others, and they want to go back there. There's a significant lesson in that, because as human beings, our desires are messed up. We frequently desire things that are profoundly harmful from us, and even when we've been delivered from them, sometimes we still desire to go back. And so God commands the people who unwittingly had become addicted to Egypt, keep the Sabbath. It's interesting, isn't it, in our modern society, we have turned Egypt very often into a virtue. Trying to recall your last day off has almost become like a boast for some. It's true. The busier you are, the more important you appear, both to yourself, to your friends, to your colleagues, to your acquaintances. How many times have you asked somebody recently how they are, and the very first thing that's come out of their mouth is one word, 4 letters, busy? It happens all the time. Happens all the time. Now, of course, sometimes life is unavoidably busy. It is for all of us. But Jesus never ever made a virtue of busyness. He never made a virtue of laziness either. So don't get me wrong, but he never made a virtue of busyness. If anything, when you read the story of Jesus, actually what Jesus so frequently is attempting to do, both for himself and also for his disciples, is actually to remove himself from the busyness of life, that he might quieten himself and his spirit and encounter his Father. But we seem in our society to have turned Egypt, the place of slavery, into a virtue, into something that we aspire to. And the problem in Jesus' day, and this is what comes out in this passage in a number of different ways, is that in Jesus' time, keeping the Sabbath had become a very complicated matter. There were so many rules and regulations associated with keeping the Sabbath that the benefits of the weekly day of rest had almost completely been lost. It, rather than being something that brought freedom and wholeness, it had become something that was oppressive. Rather than a day of delighting, it had become a day of nitpicking, of rule keeping. It was never intended to be that. And as such, Jesus' statement is so deeply profound for the people of his day. The Sabbath was made for man and woman, not man or woman for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not to be an idol to you. You don't bow down and worship the Sabbath. It was made for your good. It was made because God longs for you to have life in all of its fullness. I think we need to hear Jesus' statement just as much. A guy called Wayne Muller wrote a book all about Sabbath. And this is what he said. I think there's a slide that maybe just sort of highlights something of this. But this is what he said. He said, the successful life, meaning what's perceived in the West as a successful life, has become a violent enterprise. We make war on our bodies because we push them too hard. We make war on our children because we cannot spare them the time that they need. We make war on our spirit because we do not stop and listen to the still, small voice of God. We make war on our communities because we're so desperate to protect that which we have acquired. And we make war on the earth because we do not allow it the space to recover. When I take a funeral for somebody, one of the things I always ask the family, or whoever it is that's sort of coordinating the funeral, I always say to them when I meet them, I say, what was the one thing that you really celebrate about your loved one that's died? What was the thing that you honour and celebrate and delight in when you think about their life? Do you know they never ever say, I love the way he spent so long in the office? They never say that. I've never, ever heard someone say that. I've taken a lot of funerals. Do you know what they always say? I could almost write it down on my funeral sheet before I ask them the question. We loved the fact that they loved their family, and we loved family holidays. Almost every single funeral I have ever taken, when I've asked that question, they're the two things, amongst others, but they are the two things that people say. We loved it when they spent time with us. We loved it when we took time as a family to delight in what God had given to us. Okay, all good, but how? Well, it's a good question. I want to commend to you, there isn't time this morning. I noticed there was a clock on that. That was terrifying me throughout the first part of the service, that little clock in the top right-hand corner. I still feel slightly nervous by it. Anyway, there we go. There isn't loads of time but I want to say a few practical things, but I also want to recommend to you 3 amazing books on this subject that I would highly recommend. The first one, I've recommended this before. It really is a superb book. It's by a guy called John Mark Comer. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. I cannot recommend it highly enough, but there's a whole chapter in there about Sabbath. A large section of the book is about the practice of Sabbath, the practice of slowing down, of delighting, of stopping, of ceasing. It's a really great book. The second book, Anything by Peter Scazzaro, is really worth reading. There's a whole series of books that he's written called Emotionally Healthy ... and one of them is called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. He always talks about Sabbath in those books. He used to live in New York. He may still live in New York, I'm not sure, but he often talks so winsomely about the Jewish children as they leave school on a Friday evening, as they go into the Sabbath, just the delight that there is in their faces as they just run home because the Sabbath is about to start. And the third book to recommend is by a guy called Walter Brueggemann, who's one of the finest Old Testament scholars, certainly of our day. He wrote this incredible book called Sabbath as Resistance. Everything he writes is amazing. But he talks about the idea that the practice of Sabbath is actually a prophetic sign, an act of resistance to the idolization of work and to the injustice of a 24/7 society. Because actually, with our desire for 24/7 society, the people that suffer the most are very often the poor within our own communities, but the global poor suffer the most as a consequence of the West's desire for 24/7 living. And so he talks about the idea of the Sabbath being this act of prophetic resistance against idolizing work and the injustice that that type of society causes across the world. Amazing book. So they're worth reading. You'll get loads of tips. But let me just give a couple of simple ones, and then I'll draw this to a close. In order to practice Sabbath, it's really useful to firstly identify when the Sabbath is going to be. And it's going to be different for everybody. It's going to be different for us all. But it's worth looking at your week and thinking, when will I take that time to simply stop and to delight in the good gifts that God has given to me? It isn't always easy, and it requires some adjustment, and it's not a law. But it's worth trying to identify when that might be. It's worth doing some preparation as the Sabbath approaches. It's worth trying to do your weekly food shop or your weekly mow of the lawn in advance of the Sabbath so that you're ready. Unless, of course, the weekly food shop and mowing the lawn are the things that are life-giving to you, and maybe they are. But it's worth preparing. And it's worth planning. It's worth thinking about, what will I do with my Sabbath? How will this be a day of resting? How will this be a day of worship? How will this be a day of delighting? There's a place in San Francisco called Silicon Valley. It's one of the most frantic, creative, driven, overworked places in the Western world. But many of the companies that are based there, some of the biggest companies on earth, began to discover the benefit of what the Bible would call Sabbath. And a sort of a simple guide that they called a guide for a digital Sabbath came from Silicon Valley. And these were the 10 things they recommended to their workers for your digital Sabbath. Number 1, avoid technology. I don't mean that you can't watch TV, but there is something really beautiful about taking your phone, putting it in a drawer, and leaving it there for 6 or so hours. Connect with your loved ones. Nurture your health. Get outside. Avoid commerce. Light candles. Drink wine. Some of these are easier than others, eh? Eat bread. Find silence. Give something back. Now, if I hadn't told you they came from Silicon Valley, you might think actually they come straight out of the practice of sort of Judeo-Christianity. Apart from maybe the first one, because I don't think Jesus had a smartphone. But actually all of them are deeply rooted in the things that we see in the life of Jesus and in the practice of the church. I commend them to you, even though they did come from Silicon Valley. They're great things to do on your Sabbath. I just want to draw this to a close. I guess this morning I want to commend to you the practice of Sabbath, because Jesus commended it to us. I want to commend to you the practice of stopping, the practice of ceasing from work just for a day trusting God with your work, that you might take a day just to rest. I want to commend to you the practice of worship. I want to commend to you the practice of delighting. Taking some time to delight in what it is that God has given to you and just resting in that. This isn't supposed to be self-help. This isn't supposed to be self-care, although I think practicing the Sabbath is deeply helpful and deeply caring to our souls and to those that we love. But I think there's something about entering into those practices regularly. There's something about entering into worship and rest and delighting that draws us into the life of God in a beautiful way. There's something about those practices that draws us closer to Jesus, because they were practices that he practiced. And as we do those things, and as we fix our eyes and our hearts upon him, we find Jesus in and through those things. And so, as people who, on the whole, are terribly overworked and very often addicted to Egypt, I just want to commend to you the practice of Sabbath, that you might know God in a new and a deeper and a more precious way. Let's pray.